Hello and welcome to panel one of this exciting conference, Net Zero and Beyond, Pathways to Decarbonization, being brought to you by Cell Press and the Beijing Municipal Science and Technology Commission. My name is Muzzio, and I am a scientific editor at the journal iScience, the open access and interdisciplinary focused journal of Cell Press. It is my great honor to be here today and moderating the session on energy system decarbonization and electrification. It is clear that transitioning away from unabated fossil fuels in the energy sector is the primary pathway forward toward achieving net zero emissions. And in this endeavor, electrification has been making significant progress. One cannot discuss the topic without hearing about all the growth of electric vehicles, the prominence of battery technologies, the development of smarter grid technologies, and even the use of electricity in the chemical industry and manufacturing. However, a low carbon energy transition rooted in electrification is not just about electric vehicles. It also consists of multidisciplinary challenges, such as demand level for electricity higher than ever before, hard to abate sectors that may never be able to adapt to electrification, the need for a just transition to account for the impacts of stranded assets, heterogeneous carbon markets, and as well issues in building a reliable and resilient grid. Today, we'll be talking to 5 experts in this area: Professor Dan Kammen, Professor Denise Mauzerall, Professor Destenie Nock, Professor Xiliang Zhang, and Ankur Malyan about this exciting research field. The organization of this talk will first be a keynote talk by Professor Dan Kammen that will last about a half hour before 4 shorter presentations from our panelists. Then we will end with an interactive panel discussion that I hope you take part of, and I hope that you are as excited as me for this panel. So without further ado, I will introduce our keynote speaker for the panel, Professor Dan Kammen. His whole biography and the whole biographies of all panelists are on the conference website. But in brief, Professor Dan Kammen is the James and Catherine Lau Distinguished Professor of Sustainability at the University of California, Berkeley, with parallel appointments in the Energy and Resources Group, the Goldman School of Public Policy, and the Department of Nuclear Engineering. He was appointed the first Environment and Climate Partnership for the Americas Fellow by Secretary of State Hillary R. Clinton in April 2010. Kammen is currently on leave at the University of California while serving in the Biden administration as a senior advisor for energy innovation at the U.S. Agency of International Development. His research is focused on science and policy of decarbonized energy systems, energy access, and environmental justice. A small overview I'm sure he will share with us today. So without further ado, please go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
Well, thank you so much for the chance just to frame things a little bit and kick things off. I will share some slides. Let me get that on the screen. And I really want to thank fellow panelists and Cell for setting this up. But in particular, I want to thank the audience, because I think this is really a topic where we need to find new and clever ways to work together to uplift voices that have been silenced for too long, and also to find ways to really benefit from the diversity of our different approaches to decarbonization. And I'll just try to summarize some of the themes here using some of the partnership work that my laboratory has done with colleagues in China and colleagues in sub-Saharan Africa as 2 example touch points of this process. So Michelle, thank you so much for kind of launching this. I know that not everyone or few people use Twitter in China, but if you do, I've put up the Twitter handle for my laboratory. We have a WeChat as well. It's just my name, Dan Kammen. And the laboratory that I'll be talking about at Berkeley is called RAIL, the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory. And I'll show a few results from that work going forward. And again, the website is here, and you can find not only technical materials, but also a lot of the more popular outreach types of things we do. So all of the experts in the room don't need to see this graph. In fact, they're probably bored with this graph, but I just wanted to frame where we are a little bit in terms of what it is that the international community promised the world and what the international community has so far failed to deliver to the world. And this was the graph of where we were going. The red line was the business as usual, We had another term for it back then when we first charted it, but that would warm the world by roughly 4.5 degrees Celsius, which can mean as much as 20 degrees at the poles. And the damages we're seeing from the horrific heat waves over the Arctic and Antarctic today, the fires in Siberia, the fires in California, the fires in Australia, are all examples of the damages we're trying to avoid. And the conversation going into that COP, that COP session in Paris, COP21, was that we really needed to limit warming to 2 degrees. And at the time, a very interesting process, I would argue, in a very non-European, maybe pro-US, pro-China perspective, was that a famous meeting between Presidents Xi and Obama really led to an agreement that we could, in fact, cut off 1 degree. And that would be by countries doing what they said. And these are a series of national direct commitments. We can argue about what was in them or not. But essentially, this was the first time that countries were allowed to pick a very diverse set of strategies, from clean energy to energy efficiency to investing in forests to investing in poor communities. And if people had done what they said, that would cut off about 1 degree. In fact, there was another agreement that I was working on in the Obama White House called the Kigali Accords, which were passed, and they would cut off about another 0.5 degree. That would mean that we, instead of 4.5 degrees Celsius, perhaps we would limit warming to 3 degrees Celsius, which is certainly not enough. We therefore need to not only do what we said, which we have not done, but we also need to innovate strongly going further. And at the time, further meant to 2 degrees. But as those of you who are on or have been on the IPCC, as I was for 20 years, that 2 degree goal was lowered to 1.5 by the most recent of the IPCC reports. And those reports are coming out now. And the reduction in damages from that is really very huge. Now, I'm a physicist, not an economist. If I was an economist, I would say this job is hard enough as is. Trying to cut out 90 or 95 or 105% of global emissions is a nearly impossible job. So adding additional constraints makes that job even harder. Thankfully, I'm a physicist, very much not an economist. And so I don't suffer all of the problems of that dismal profession. And in my view, adding racial and socioeconomic justice makes this job easier, not harder. And that's really where I think the physicist worldview differs very strongly from the economist worldview. And in fact, coming out of the most recent climate conference in Glasgow, COP26, we have a world map of countries that have made promises. Generally, the lighter the color, the earlier the promise. Sweden has one of the earlier promises. I'm skeptical they will get there, but everyone defines their climate damages differently, and so maybe they will. And so what you see is that some of the Western European countries have very early goals. If you look carefully, you'll see in green, we have places like Guyana and Suriname. In particular, the Gambia and elsewhere, Madagascar, that perhaps have achieved their targets. The way we do the math is a bit tricky. But as we get further out in the future to places in the world that have targets for 2050 in red, and then later targets 2060 and 70 in China and India and elsewhere, we start to get targets that are climate-wise unacceptable. They may be good politically internally, but we need to accelerate all of these targets. And in fact, many of the places that have set targets in the 2030s and 40s and even 2050s, such as the United States, are far from on pace to get there. So we have to find ways to not only do what we've said, but to accelerate that process. And to me, adding climate justice actually makes that job easier. And this, I think, is really the most important picture that's emerged from that conversation in the last decade. And this is to note that if we look at the history of emissions or what we're going to do to the climate, the richest 1% of the people on the planet are accounting for roughly 15% of cumulative emissions from 1990 to 2015. And the richest 10% are more than half of the world's emissions. And then if we look at the poorest 50%, they are they account for roughly 7% of emissions. So this world is topsy-turvy, and we're going to have to find ways to dramatically accelerate social justice if we hope to make our climate goals work, to essentially invert this unacceptable story. The one interesting message here, the one that I think keeps getting buried, is that what we find is that while the richest 1% must dramatically reduce their emissions by a factor of 30 or more, the poorest chunk of the global population could increase their emissions and actually would probably do so at all of our benefit by being integrated better into the services in an increasingly green energy economy. So I say that to really set the stage for this challenging non-economic perspective. And in my world right now in the US government, I'm largely focused, although not exclusively, on the work of one particular program, Power Africa, which is an effort across the US government to work on bringing new energy. The goal for Power Africa is 30,000 megawatts, 30 gigawatts of new, cleaner energy for Africa, and 60 million or more new connections by 2030. In fact, these are goals that we're going to have to really increase by orders of magnitude to really make a dent and a difference. And I note that in terms of thinking about these so-called sustainable development goals, there are some really critical actors and partners. So the bottom left picture, we're standing with the Nigerian Minister of Power, the Nigerian Minister of the Environment, and the United Nations Special Representative, Damilolo Ugunyubi, who will be here at University of California, Berkeley for the next 3 days, strategizing with some of our panelists, Professor Nock and others, around how do we really accelerate these goals from large gigawatt projects to some of the smallest cooking project. This is in visiting a woman in northern Rwanda and looking at some of the energy options available. And again, I'm going to try to highlight just how some of these themes work together. But one of the things that we all know is a not direct energy issue, but the employment in the energy sector is highly biased towards males worldwide. And I just highlight that with a program that I'm very proud of at not only at Power Africa and the U.S. Agency for National Development, but as a new initiative from the Prime Minister of Vietnam, and it's an effort to dramatically diversify employment in the energy sector. And here are two kind of images of those efforts, from metering to cable issues to planning, really trying to diversify the energy economies in their countries. Long story about technological innovation, kind of my favorite topic, and the process we've used to make technologies cheaper, the mixture of technology push, i.e. investing in basic material science innovation, demand pull, a whole variety of things, has generated this interesting position today where we have seen dramatic, I wouldn't say unprecedented, they're actually quite well predicted from a bit of not economics, but kind of engineering systems thinking, where the cost of technologies that we can mass produce have fallen dramatically. And so what we see are the price declines for wind, solar, and energy storage. And over the last decade, the prices of wind has dropped by 60%. The price of solar by 90%, and the price of batteries by over 90%, meaning that batteries have actually shown the most innovation of these three technologies over the past decade. All are critical. We're going to need these and many more. We'll talk later on about smart buildings and heat pumps and a variety of technologies. But this shows the yes, we can aspect of the story. The challenge is, how do we accelerate this dramatically? And how do we learn from our past mistakes and make justice much more central to the equation? And again, today we're in this remarkable situation, not believed by all utility executives, even though they should, that it's now cheaper in most parts of the world, in most economic situations, to build a new renewable energy power plant than it is to simply operate an existing fossil fuel plant. Now, when I was a grad student many decades ago, when we got to this point, I would have thought story solved. But in fact, all this has done is open the equation for the really difficult fight, because what we're finding now is that unlike 30 years ago, where we needed dramatic new technology, and we still need new innovation, the real battles are around the political, the economic processes. And right now we live in a world where globally we subsidize fossil fuels to a larger degree than we invest in renewables, despite all of these dramatic changes. So in my home state of California, we set a goal for 2010 to be 20% powered by renewable energy. We missed that goal. We didn't hit it until 2013. And our goal for 2020 was to be 1/3 powered by renewables. We hit that goal only 4 years after the 2013. So by the end of 2017, we were well above 33%. And in fact, today, we have a law on the books requiring California to be carbon neutral, not just the energy sector, but the whole economy by 2045. And by 2030, we need to be 60% powered by renewables, something which we're operating more than today. And this really shows that if we marshal these things, we can make a remarkable change. Before I move on from this slide, I want to highlight maybe the most important aspect is not these clean energy targets, but the fact that what California did was to say that 35% of all of the revenues from our cap and trade program must be spent on underserved, poor, most polluted fence line communities. The Biden administration took that 35% target and beat us. The federal goal, called Justice 40, being run by a remarkable scholar and policymaker at the Department of Energy, Dr. Shalonda Baker, is a 40% of all federal infrastructure spending in this area must be spent on underserved communities. So we know we can do it. If I return to the California case, though, just to illustrate how quickly we can move, late last year in April, California, the 5th largest economy on the planet, hit 95% power from renewable sources. Now, this was a good day. It was in the spring. We had good sun. We had good wind. But if you look at the graph, what you'll see is the amount of solar power and wind ramped up dramatically. The amount of gas we need to use, which is in orange, went down. The amount of hydropower went to basically zero, and California does not count nuclear and does not count hydro, large hydro, toward its goals. And California went from a net importer of about 5,000 megawatts to a net exporter of over 2,000 megawatts during that peak time. So that's a remarkable swing for such a large economy. If we can do this for a given day in 2021, surely we can do this overall by 2030. The federal US government version of this story is to not only work hard, although right now we are waiting for certain critical bills to pass, and there's skepticism they will pass, but on the international front, countries that want to partner on these efforts join a global effort called Net Zero World. The first 5 countries signed on to this process are Nigeria, Egypt, Argentina, Chile, and Indonesia. And with the horrific events in Ukraine, they are on hold, but Ukraine is one of the early signatories on this. And my hope is that many hundreds of billions of the frozen Russian assets, when this invasion is over, are directed to Ukraine to rebuild their economy and to do so greenly. But you can see here the US agencies, my own home agency, USAID included, are part of this team to partner on the technical side, on the policy side, and on the deployment side of this process. And again, I highlighted the slide before showing the team at the COP26 meeting, again, highlighting the work of Damalola Ogunyubi here on the far right, the Secretary General of the United Nations Special Representative for Energy Access and Justice around the planet. I want to highlight that the number of countries that have made major steps forward is interesting and often underlooked. Here I am visiting the largest solar thermal with storage project in the world. It's not in Germany, it's not in Denmark, it's not in China, it's certainly not in the United States, it's in Morocco. And this facility in southern Morocco is actually one that has become a hub of university transition where the new data science and environmental engineering majors have become the largest majors at many of the country's outstanding universities. You can see from the graphic here, there's the solar field, but in the middle, there's the salt thermal storage system that gives the system more than 8 hours of energy storage, much longer than typical lithium battery systems. But it's an example of not only pivoting one's energy sector, but of pivoting one's educational system. At the other end of the extreme, we have a country like Kenya, which is 95% powered by renewables, largely because they have the best discovered on-land wind resource in Africa. This is the Lake Turkana wind farm in the north of the country, and they have some of the best geothermal. Right now, Kenya is the #1 site for new deployed geothermal in the world, just edging ahead of New Zealand and Iceland as the top places, although we in California still have the largest geothermal plant of any country. Now, I've mentioned the justice part of the equation. Part of making this transition is stopping the investment in technologies that harm people and planet. And one of the most important announcements was made by China at the opening of the United Nations General Assembly last September, when President Xi announced that China would no longer fund overseas coal projects. Now, I commend this. I truly wish China had gone further to say they will no longer fund overseas fossil fuel projects, investing instead in geothermal, solar, and wind. And for the countries that accept or find nuclear part of their solution space, that's a possibility too. But this is an area that I am personally hopeful China will accelerate their announcement. So at the next United Nations session in September 22, we'll get the next stage, and that is to end overseas funding of fossil fuel projects. The critical story that all of us involved in the research side of the equation, on the economic side, on the policy side is we need to not only ramp down the amount of fossil fuel use, but we also need to replace those lost jobs and more with jobs in the clean energy, in the energy justice, and the ecological repair space. And this is the really critical part of the story going forward. So in California, I've highlighted that 35% of our cap and trade money must be spent on underserved communities. And in fact, in a recent piece on environmental justice, Manuel Pastor, a leading scholar on social and racial justice, professor at University of Southern California, and I highlighted to our governor here in California that we must accelerate our zero carbon date, not from 2045 to 2040, but all the way forward to 2030. And again, this is a huge challenge, but it's one where we calculate the jobs benefits are there because there are more jobs to be had in clean energy than jobs we lose in fossil energy. The problem is that transition is difficult and looks like job losses unless you build the kind of thing Morocco has into your equation. I'll do this in very quickly, but I want to highlight that just because it's green doesn't mean it's equitable. In a large-scale study that my laboratory did with Google, we took a database of all rooftops in the United States and census data from around the country to find that if we look at communities, neighborhoods around the country, and we look at who has solar power and who doesn't, well, the metric we used was if the community has more than 50% of one individual race, white, black, brown, Latino, as we often call it here, or Asian American, if there's no ethnic majority over a wide range of incomes, from $25,000 a year, which is below our poverty line, to 10 times higher, $250,000 US, there's no majority. But when we look at it by communities with a majority, you can see that white majority communities are almost 50% more likely to have solar on their rooftops than minority communities. In African American communities, it's 50 to 70% less likely to see solar across this range of income. Hispanic communities, it's 50% less likely to see solar. And so we see that even if the technology is part of what we consider to be the green process, or the just process, we can do it wrong. And so we have a lot to learn, and highlighting these equity benefits and these misuses of that is really one of the critical parts of the story. So let me conclude by just saying there are fascinating examples of doing it right. Here is a story in Shenzhen, China, which unfortunately is suffering a serious COVID issue at the moment. But while you'll notice that there is a problem with the gender diversity of taxi drivers in Shenzhen, this is a ceremony when those drivers receive their electric taxis in an effort put forward by the Shenzhen city government to transition entirely to electric taxis. So here we are at that ceremony. Shenzhen was successful. They were able to replace all 29, now almost 30,000 taxis with electric taxis, but doing that overnight meant that they had an immediate problem. So I'll play a little video, and not much will happen in this video because all of those taxis then went to queue up to line up to recharge. So what you see is that without a smart energy system, they were able to transition to electric vehicles, but they did not build the capacity to charge them. So what anyone does in this 21st century era is exactly what our little company based in Chengdu, China did, and that is to build an app, and that app tells the drivers how many parking bays, recharge bays are available. You can see these are solar-powered charging bays. When I last checked, this was the largest charging station in the world with 600 charging bays available, and the app gives drivers a chance to register for one of those slots. And if you arrive on time, you get points added to your ranking, and you get earlier choice. And if you're late, you get points deducted. This saved drivers almost 45 minutes waiting time a day, increased their revenues by 15%, and generated a much more efficient use of those charging bays. Now the city of Shenzhen is looking at doing inductive on-road charging, and this is really an Internet of Energy Things approach to justice. I'll conclude super quickly by highlighting that in the off-grid situation, we're also seeing remarkable opportunities. This is in the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the most challenging countries to work in terms of violence and ethnic challenges. And what we see here is an effort done by a small nonprofit group called Energy Peace Partners to bring what is today the largest mini grid in sub-Saharan Africa to this war-torn region by selling shares in a community project through a new financial mechanism called PRECs, Peace Renewable Energy Credits, that are invested in by companies around the world that want to contribute to clean energy for underserved communities. In fact, a number of projects have gone forward in this area, one of which is an effort to invest in what are now being called DREs, Distributed Renewable Energy Credits. And you can see here how clean the grid is determines how well you benefit from that process. And so what we're seeing now is companies are bidding on credits, and the cleaner the local grid, like the solar grid I just showed you here in the Congo, gets a very clean ranking, gets better credits for the companies that invest, and dirtier grids, such as diesel generator grids or the grids in some of the more polluting parts of the world, run off of coal and fossil fuels, get less credits. So far, this program is only 6 months old. It's been very successful. You can see the range of funders and donors, companies and organizations that have jumped on this so-called DREC effort, Distributed Renewable Energy Credits effort. This is the kind of program we need to dramatically accelerate so we can go into the next climate conference having said we didn't just provide clean energy for the world's rich, we reached out to the communities most at risk and found ways to install these technologies there. In the United States, we just had a major breakthrough. A court ruling was just lifted. This now means that the federal government can proceed with an effort to utilize a social cost of carbon and of methane in its analyses. And when the federal government uses this metric, it not only does it for its own use, but it forces everyone that does business with the federal government to also ultimately use this metric. Now, this was just approved by the courts a few days ago, but it's an opportunity to build the economics of the future around metrics such as the social cost of carbon that reflect damage to ecosystems, but also damage to the poorest individuals. It is a pro-justice, pro-environment way to move forward. Last point to mention is that the clean energy revolution is going to require massive increases. By some estimates, 1,000% increases in the amount of many of the critical materials. And so finding ways to mine and utilize and to protect workers and to protect countries such as the Congo as we access these materials as sustainably as possible is one of the other huge challenges. So I end there. I know I've gone a few minutes over, but I want to thank you all for listening and just join me in this conversation with these exceptional panelists as we talk about some of these aspects of the decarbonization process. So thank you so much. And let me turn the screen back over to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much for the wonderful keynote and overview. You really addressed so much of what we're going to talk about in our time together today. And your slides about Morocco and Kenya really struck out to me. And your final slide about critical materials is really relevant to the panel that's going to come after us, which the keynote will be Elsa Olivetti, and we're talking all to your points about critical materials. So thank you for kind of doing my work for me and addressing the kind of conversation we're going to have. One logistical note I just want to point out, Professor Xiliang Zhang will not be able to join this discussion today as he had an emergent meeting that was very important. However, Professor Zhang, also from the same institute at Tsinghua, will be able to join and will also present during our discussion. I just wanted to fill you all in on that. But now we will get to begin our presentations from our panelists, which I'm really excited for. So they'll be a little bit shorter, but still a really good overview into what they're going to talk about today. So first we have Professor Denise Mauzerall. She is jointly appointed in the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. The Mauzerall Group conducts a scientific research that informs the development of far-sighted energy and environmental policy. Her research examines the opportunities to simultaneously reduce air pollutant and greenhouse gas emissions and evaluates the resulting benefits for climate, public health, and food security. I really look forward to hearing your talk today, and please take it away, Professor Mauzerall.
Thanks so much, Michelle. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm excited that Cell Press has put this together and that it's joint with the Beijing Municipal Environmental Organization. So let me just share my slides here. Can you see them?
Yeah, yes, just not on, it's not on the full screen yet. There we go.
Okay, great. So I'm delighted to talk about the co-benefits of electrification. My group works looking at opportunities where you can reduce air pollution, which improves human health, while also reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases. So we have looked at opportunities in industry, power, transport, and residential sectors to reduce air pollution emissions and resulting concentrations, reduce premature mortalities due to air pollution, and reduce the associated greenhouse gas emissions. And today I'll focus on the residential sector and the use of these small coal stoves in China and opportunities to both reduce indoor air pollution, but also ambient air pollution through selection of clean heaters. And we'll look at the implications of those clean heaters, depending on which they are, on greenhouse gas emissions as well as on health. And then I'll also talk about how improving air quality through reducing the use of fossil fuels allows increased solar PV generation efficiencies. So this is a schematic of how I'll present some of our results, where we look at synergies and trade-offs of various interventions. And you can see here a change in total CO2 emissions, either a synergy where there's a decrease or a trade-off where there's an increase, and then a reduction in the premature deaths resulting from reductions in air pollution. So this is a paper that came out a few years ago where we introduced the idea that these solid fuel stoves were a major and underappreciated ambient pollution source. We did that by doing air quality modeling in the Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei region, first just in the winter of 2010, and then we simply removed the residential emissions from Beijing in one simulation and removed the residential emissions from Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei in a second set of simulations. And what you see here is that if you remove Beijing's residential solid fuel stoves relative to the base PM2.5 concentrations, you can reduce the PM 2.5 in Beijing by about 25%. But if the 3 provinces all remove their residential coal stoves and they're replaced with clean heaters, you can reduce the PM 2.5 by about half. In Tianjin, reducing the emissions from Beijing don't help that much, but reducing the emissions from these residential stoves in all 3 provinces can reduce the emissions again by about 50%. And Hebei, you see a similar major reduction from the 3 provinces working to eliminate these stoves together. So this is an environmental justice issue in the sense that these stoves are mostly used by the rural poor, but they're also really important for ambient air quality. And so after the Chinese government implemented major reductions in the use of these stoves, pollution, PM 2.5 in China's the concentrations began to drop. And we also see how regional transport of air pollution is very important, because even in Beijing, reducing the emissions from the Beijing area alone was insufficient to improve the air quality as much as if you got reductions, elimination of these stoves in all 3 provinces. So a big question then is, what should replace these stoves? And what are the impacts of the alternative stoves on air quality, health, and climate? So to address this, we looked at improved coal stoves, where they either have high or low emissions depending on the type of stove and the type of coal that's used. Natural gas heaters, electric heaters, which are either electric resistance heaters or electric heat pumps. And the electric heaters can either be powered with 2015 grid-based electricity, which in China was about 68% coal, or 2030 power, which we projected would be about 35% coal. And you'll see quite big differences in the results of, in these cases. So this paper just came out a couple of months ago. And again, we were looking at synergies and trade-offs for air quality, human health, carbon emissions. And we took the work a bit beyond that and also looked at the household costs that are incurred depending on the clean heaters which are implemented, as a function both of the absolute capital costs, the operating costs, and subsidies. The method was to set up a 2015 base year, estimate the life cycle emissions of these air pollutants, CO2 and methane, from direct combustion, from the power generation, as I mentioned, and also from upstream fuel production, simulate the fine particle concentrations, calculate the PM 2.5 related premature mortalities, and evaluate the capital and operating costs for households, which in poor areas can be a substantial concern. So what we found here was that there are cases where there are clear trade-offs. What you're seeing here is changes in residential CO2 emissions on the x-axis and changes in premature mortality due to the change in air pollution on the y-axis. In the case of all of these alternative heaters, air pollution levels and premature deaths decreased. But the implications for climate differ. If you're using resistance heaters, which have low capital costs, and so are attractive to the poor to purchase initially, you increase your CO2 emissions. Clean coal with improved stoves that have high emission factors, meaning not the cleanest coal you could get, also increase CO2 emissions. But if you go to the either 2030 grid or low emitting clean coal stoves, you get a decrease in CO2 and a substantial decrease, a further decrease in air pollutant caused premature mortalities. And if you go to air source heat pumps, even with the 2015 grid, you get a reduction in CO2 equivalent emissions. 2030 grid, even further reduction with air source heat pumps. And if the grid became fully decarbonized, which is clearly a necessary step to full decarbonization of the economy, you can eliminate those CO2 emissions from this sector and have an enormous decrease in emissions. Natural gas heaters fall somewhat in between, and they're tricky because building natural gas infrastructure means you have committed emissions going forward. And so that in the sense of future fossil infrastructure has a clear downside, but they're also relatively inexpensive to purchase and so are attractive in the short term. If you look here, though, at household cost, you can see there's a big difference between the cost for rural households, shown with dashed squares, and the cost for urban households. Urban households pay less, cost less, because their homes are smaller and they tend to be less leaky. But you can also see that these are unsubsidized total annualized costs. So this is amortizing the capital costs over the lifetime of the device and adding in the annual operating cost. So resistance heaters are actually the most expensive because they use so much electricity and have such high associated carbon emissions. Gas heaters are cheaper, but again, they have implications for long-term infrastructure build out of fossil fuels. Heat pumps are in the middle, but their costs are primarily coming from high capital costs. And so these can be made much more attractive by subsidies. And we see in Beijing substantial subsidies already in place for heat pumps. And we recommend that substantial subsidies be considered in surrounding provinces to make these alternative heaters more cost effective for the poor. And then here you can see clean coal being about the same cost as the dirtiest dispersed coal because those improved stoves are more efficient. Okay, so what about the effect of air pollution on solar generation? Here you can see a schematic where you have ambient particles in the atmosphere that impede the penetration of solar energy to the surface. And here you can see a solar panel which generates less electricity as the aerosol particles scatter the incoming radiation, but also as the aerosols deposit on the surface of the panel, because that makes the panel dirtier and reduces the generation. And so we looked at first at China to see what happens due to the air pollution in the air pollution in the column over panels in China. We used surface irradiance data and a PV performance model to evaluate that. What you see here is that the baseline mean daily surface irradiance for PV panels at a fixed angle, ones that aren't tracking the sun. You can see that due to clouds and aerosols, the incident radiation at the surface is lower in the eastern part of China, where most people live, and much higher in the western part of China. We find that the atmospheric fine particles over eastern China reduce solar PV output by more than 25%. You can see particularly in these highly populated eastern provinces, the aerosol particles in the column reduce the generation. We then went on to expand this work to look at the whole world and looked at the global reduction of solar power generation efficiency due to atmospheric aerosols and panel soiling. And so here you can see the surface solar irradiance, the amount of energy reaching the surface, including atmospheric aerosols and clouds. So you can see areas that have a lot of insolation, North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, Australia, Western China. And then so we then did the same type of methodology we used before, where we used a PV performance model to calculate capacity factors at each grid cell. And then we looked at surface irradiance, the amount of energy reaching the surface, and then aerosol deposition data, the amount of aerosols depositing on the solar panel, to calculate how much the air pollution and the soiling of the panels reduces the solar PV generation efficiency. And then we looked at different removal scenarios where either the panels were not cleaned or they were cleaned quarterly, monthly, or weekly, to see how much of a difference that made in the PV generation. So you can see here that the capacity factors are reduced substantially by dirty PV panels. Here you can see what the capacity factors are for clean panels and for ones that are uncleaned. So you can see dramatic reductions in Eastern China and North Africa due to pollution and dust on these panels. And here you can see the separation of the total reduction of capacity factor due to first aerosol reduction in the atmosphere and due to soiling reduction. If we look at the North China plain, you can see that if you could fully remove the particles in the atmosphere, you could increase the capacity factor by about 40%. But if you clean the panels, you could increase the capacity factor by over 100%. You could more than double your generation. So this is a substantial improvement. If you look at these circles, you can see that the capacity factor without aerosol effects is about 0.21, and with aerosol effects is as low as 0.13. So here you can see this is the world, and you can see here highlighted is China, and how if you clean these panels, either keeping them always clean, you can double your generation in the North China Plain. But even cleaning them only quarterly, you can increase your generation by 50%. So there's a clear win-win opportunity of increased electrification with renewable energy, and increased use of renewable energy decreases emissions of air pollutants and greenhouse gases due to fossil fuel combustion, leading to improvements in public health and climate. Air quality improvements lead to better public health and increased solar generation efficiency. And in resource abundant regions, cleaning PV panels can increase electricity generation by more than 50% if they're highly dusty or highly polluted regions. So a virtuous cycle exists. Air quality improvements increase efficiency of solar PV generation, and more generation and electrification will reduce emissions of CO2 and air pollutants and will improve public health. There's one caution I'd like to mention, which is that in this huge effort we have globally to electrify as much of our economy as we can, a compound called sulfur hexafluoride is now widely being used as an insulator in high voltage transmission. It's the strongest known greenhouse gas, 36,000 times stronger than CO2. It has a lifetime of over 3,000 years. Its atmospheric concentrations are increasing. You can see here from it's gone up by about a factor of 2.5 in the last 20 years. And so for electrification with decarbonized electricity to fully address climate forcing, it's really critical to implement substitutes for SF6. And there are some substitutes that are in the works. There seems to be some discussion over simply using vacuum panels with purified air. It's some possibility that Siemens is exploring, and there's other possibilities too, but it's an area I think that deserves further attention. So with that, thank you so much for your attention. I'm honored to be here, and also honored to follow on Dan Kammen's excellent overview. So I look forward to the discussion later. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that add-on to the discussion, and I really like the last sort of takeaway slides. That was a really useful slide that I would love to all students to just see and just capture the whole essence of your talk today. So first, our next panelist is Professor Destenie Nock. Professor Nock is an assistant professor in civil and environmental engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. She creates optimization and decision analysis tools which evaluate the sustainability, equity, and reliability of power systems in the US and sub-Saharan Africa. She's a leader in energy justice and sustainable energy transition trade-off analysis. And we are so excited to have her here today on this panel. So without further ado, if you could take it away, Professor Nock.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me today. So today, what I am going to be discussing is how electricity demand in vulnerable groups may impact our decarbonization efforts. And building on the work that Dan Kammen presented earlier, how he said that energy justice can make this transition easier, I think that one of the main ways it'll make it easier is by helping us understand the trade-offs. So in my group, we look a lot at trade-offs between equality and justice objectives, environmental sustainability objectives, and development and transition objectives. And our goal, of course, is to improve all of these, but any decision that we have inherently will lead us to have to balance between, maybe we progress in one area and not the other, but maybe we move slowly forward in both areas. So first, with just getting us all on the same page about how energy poverty is typically measured in the US, we see that it's really focused on energy burden, which is seen in this large map here, where the lighter the color is, the less annual percent of income that people spend on their housing and energy bills. And the darker the color, the darkest color on this map means that people in this county are spending more than 19% of their income on meeting their energy bills. But when we're looking at these concentric circles of energy poverty, energy insecurity, and energy burden, we see that cost and expenditure concerns is really at the core of energy poverty, but it doesn't capture everything. And it misses out sometimes on energy insecurity, which are reliability concerns, and energy poverty, which are those supply concerns, as well as insecurity, as well as energy burden. And so if we're considering two households, and household one has an income of about $30,000, they spend 5% of their disposable income on meeting their energy needs, then the traditional energy burden measure of do you spend more than 10% of your income meeting your energy needs would actually say that this household is not energy poor. And if we have a second household that makes about $100,000 a year, and they also spend 5% of their income on meeting their energy needs, the energy burden also defines them as not energy poor. And what is a challenge here is that the traditional energy burden measure, the percent of income that a household spends on meeting their energy needs, does not capture human behavior, and it does not capture people's tendency to reduce their consumption in order to save money. So we have been studying in my group what we're calling the energy equity gap, and this is a study based in Arizona. So imagine this graph here is the energy usage within a high-income house, and on the x-axis we have the temperature, the outdoor temperature, and on the y-axis we have the electricity usage in the household. So if we actually first looked at when they turn on their AC unit, that's what we're going to call the cooling inflection temperature, represented by this blue line. And when we looked at the low-income households in the region, we noticed that there was a large gap between high-income and low-income households, and this gap ranged between 4 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit in terms of the outdoor temperature. So just to reiterate, we found that low-income households wait 4 to 7 degrees longer in terms of the outdoor temperature to even just turn on their air conditioning units. And this could mean that, one, they are not able, or they feel like they are not able to consume as much energy as they would like. Then the other thing that we noticed is if we were to map these two energy consumption profiles together, we actually see that low-income groups are exhibiting less changes in air conditioning usage per temperature degree change, which could be mistaken for energy efficiency when it's actually an energy justice issue, because they are most likely not able to use their appliances as much as they would like. They are also more likely to maybe not have their appliances, for example, if they only have fans, when they could have instead of a whole home system AC unit. And I think that this really builds on Dr. Mauzerall's work that she just presented, because when we're thinking about switching from coal or natural gas heating systems to electrification heating systems and air conditioning systems, this can really help us identify how electrification may reduce this energy limiting behavior. It could also make it cheaper, because we saw that this is highly correlated to cost. So now just looking over time, we mapped the different income groups here, where on the x-axis we have the different years of our study from 2015 to 2019. On the y-axis we have the inflection temperature, which again is the outdoor temperature at which a household turns on their air conditioning unit. And the pink line at the bottom represents the highest income group, and the gray line at the top represents the lowest income group. And so we see very consistently that the lower income groups are always waiting longer than the highest income groups to turn on their air conditioning unit. And the gap starts off around 6 degrees Fahrenheit. It falls to around 4.7 degrees Fahrenheit. This is actually following a decrease in residential electricity prices. And then over time, it starts to widen. And this is correlated with increasing energy costs, which could reduce with decarbonization, particularly when we see the retirement of high-cost fossil fuel plants. And this study is currently accepted in Nature Communications and published as a preprint as Kong et al. So then when we look at how COVID has impacted energy limiting behavior, we do see that there are some changes. So this graph is showing you the percent change in hourly electricity consumption on the x-axis, And we have the different groups. So we just have the overall population for our study in Arizona and Illinois. We have our low, middle, and high income groups, and then the white and minority populations. And we see that overall, there was a 4 to 6 degree increase in residential electricity consumption during the COVID pandemic due to the stay-at-home orders and the work-from-home orders. But we see that there are large differences between white and minority groups in Arizona, which is the orange line. And Arizona has a large population using electricity for both cooling and heating. So this, again, is important to consider as we're building out our renewable energy systems. We're moving forward with decarbonization and thinking about how much we need to build. If we are, seeing that populations are limiting their energy consumption, but then when the cost of energy falls and they start to use, what they had hoped to use in the first place, we will need to make sure that we are thinking about how to build that system as well as absorbing that extra energy usage. And that brings us to one place for innovation, which could be demand response for poverty alleviation and decarbonization. So if we look at this curve where we have time on the x-axis and the percent of total system supply on the y-axis, the orange curve here is the total system demand. And at the top is the traditional demand response, where if you would typically go to a wealthy household that is in theory over-consuming, you'd say, hey, when our total system supply is reached its limit, would you allow us to kind of reduce your temperature in the winter? Maybe we would increase your temperature in the summer and make you a little bit more uncomfortable. But one of the things that we know is that there are a lot of households that are under consuming. And so this is an opportunity to innovate in terms of demand response. It could also make the system more economically efficient by providing an extra revenue stream for renewable energy power plants, as well as an opportunity for to use households as some would say battery type systems, where you could store some energy in households that are willing to be a little bit more uncomfortable, and then kind of alleviate the system demand in that way, and also reduce the need for ramping. So some quick final thoughts are as we're looking at low-income groups, we see some energy limiting behavior. If we do not incorporate this into our larger system planning for decarbonization efforts, it could mean that we underbuild the system. And when the costs fall for actual energy consumption, we actually might see mismatches of supply and demand. We need innovation in identifying energy poverty, energy limiting behavior, and implementing demand response. And demand response can overall help reduce energy poverty and balance out the system. I would like to thank my group. This is my research team and our contact information and my references.
Great. Thank you so much for that presentation. And it was really awesome to see your group at the end too. I love when people do that. So our next presentation, who will give their perspective on this topic, will be Professor Zhang. Professor Zhang is professor at the Institute of Energy and Environment and Economy at Tsinghua University. His main research interests are the energy transition and climate policy in China. So without further ado, if you could share your screen and begin your talk, we're really excited. I think you might have to unmute yourself.
Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Michelle. And I apologize that Professor Xiliang Zhang had a urgent meeting at the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. And I have to say, this kind of last minute call or notice is very common in China after China announced the carbon peaking and carbon neutrality goal. So a lot of ministries are preparing new policies, and it's a very good timing for the researcher. We have a lot of new things to study, but we also always face the pressure, to meet some last minute requirement. And also we have too many new policies to study. So here today, I will just briefly present some of our studies that has not been published, but I think that may reflect some of the new policy changes in China. So here, first I will discuss like our perspectives about the future China's energy transition. So here, this figure presents like two scenarios, the emissions under two scenarios. The dotted line represents the reference scenario that represents the emissions trajectory if China did not release the new policies like in like 2 years ago. So if we just extend the historical path of China's energy transition, we may expect this shape of emission trajectory. But in 2020, like all the things changed, and China has announced the emission peaking goal before 2030 and the carbon neutrality goal by 2060. And we have put out this kind of emission trajectory that represents our expectation, like how China's emissions could evolve in the future. And we use our energy modeling tool to examine how the energy mix will change in China. So the left figure shows the total energy consumption by different energy type over years, and the left figure shows the share of different energy type. And we can see by 2060, the non-fossil energy, so this is a specific energy term in China that includes renewable, hydro, solar, wind, and also nuclear. So they in total will represent at least 80% of primary energy supply or consumption. This is actually, this 80% share is written in China's top-level policy document. You may have heard of the 1+N low carbon or emission zero emission policy framework in China. So that's one represents the very top-level policy document from the central government. The N represents different ministries, directives to push forward the energy transition. And in the one document from the national, from the central government, the top-level document, it is written that by 2060, at least 80% of China's total energy supply will come from the non-fossil energy. So I think that is a hard target, and that's set a very hard constraint for China's future energy transition. And here is another, I think, very big trend in China's energy system transition in the next 40 years, which is the further electrification. Now, electricity only takes less than 30% of China's energy consumption, and we expect by 2060, it will reach about 70 or 80. So I think maybe there could be even larger uncertainty range for this number, because we still have a lot of uncertainties about some end-use electrification technologies, like hydrogen from renewable electricity, and then to replace some energy use in industrial process. But we expect the electricity will take off very soon, and the major supply of electricity, and we expect, will also come from the non-fossil energy, and we expect the share will be even higher than 80%. So I think we think it would reach around 90%, and remaining fossil generation in the electricity sector will be equipped with the carbon capture and storage. And here, this is the number that, is a figure that we represent how the emission reduction from over years, like from different channels. So we see there are like channels like energy efficiency improvement or the so-called the optimization of internal structure of fossil energy. This literally means, substituting coal by natural gas. And we see these, measures could take a higher share in the initial phase of emission reduction in China. But in the later phase, we expect the non-fossil energy substitution, substituting coal, natural gas by renewable electricity, and also the CCUS will contribute much more in the later phase. And so that's why that I also discussed the electricity sector, the decarbonization is extremely important. And here, this figure shows the expected carbon price, which is also the marginal basement cost in China over years. And we all know that having a price for carbon, as Professor Kammen mentioned in his presentation, is extremely important for investors to make their decision in the process of decarbonization. And this is also very important for the decarbonizing China's power sector. And my second part of my presentation will just very briefly talk about the ongoing national emission trading scheme in China. So I use this figure just to briefly say the major difference between China's national emission scheme and the very typical classical cap and trade scheme that in the Europe and also in the US, California. So China's actually does not currently have a cap and trade system. The national emission trading scheme actually now is implemented as a tradable performance standard. It means the power sector or a power plant, for example, because now the ETS only covers power sector, it will cover more energy intensive sectors in later, but here I just use a power plant as example. The power plant actually does not receive a fixed amount of emission allowances from the government. It actually receive the free allowances from government based on their output, the electricity generation, and also based on their generation type. So here, this is the simplest example. Now we only have two power sector. We have benchmark. It is the green line here. It means for each kilowatt hour generation that the power plant generates, it will receive, for example, a certain fixed amount of free allowances, like maybe 1 kilogram, for example. And then we will see that the more you generate, you may receive more allowances. And here we have like low efficiency plant on the left, and a high efficiency plant on the right. For each kilowatt hour generation, the one plant generates, it will receive like 1 kilogram allowances. But the left plant is low efficient plant. For each kilowatt hour generation it generates, it has to emit like maybe 1.1 kilogram emissions. So then for each kilowatt hour generation it have to pay additional money. It have to buy permits from other, like for high efficiency plants. So here is the kind of a floating cap, but it's essentially have this type of incentive for like the high efficiency plant. It's like a subsidy. It will subsidize this high efficiency plant and also kind of incentivize them to produce more electricity. So the more electricity they produce, they will receive more allowances. And for the low efficiency plant, this emission trading system actually plays as a tax. So it has a levy a tax on those low efficiency plants. So we have this kind of special design for the national emission trading scheme. Like our institute has been involved in this policymaking process for years. This actually consider a lot of characteristics of China's energy system and also the power system features. And I think if we have chances to discuss in the future, we will have like more information why we have this kind of system design. And actually with this specific system, policy system, we have done some simulation with International Energy Agency to see how this kind of special design will change the policy, the energy mix in China's power sector. So the stylized example that I presented is just with one benchmark, but actually China's ETS system that covers the power sector had actually 4 benchmarks for different coal technology and different, like for different gas technology. And we simulate like 2 policies here, like one is, just a reference. So here is just a reference scenario, and one policy scenario is like the treatment performance standard, the benchmark system that I presented, and all the allowances are allocated for free. And another scenario is that, well, we may introduce auction in the ETS. And with auctioning, the firms will not receive the allowances for free, and they will participate in auctioning, and they have to buy some of their allowances. And here is the very quick review of the results. And with the current design, we'll see the emissions from the power sector will peak and will decrease after 2030. And the allowances price, will reach around 700 yuan per ton. It's roughly like $50 per ton. And when we check how the power system actually decarbonize, reduce their emissions, we'll see with the current design, the large share of the emission reduction will actually come from the switch from less efficient coal technology to more efficient coal technologies. As I just mentioned, because this the ETS system subsidize the high efficient technology and tax the low efficient technology. So most of this emission reduction comes from this channel. And also later, there could be a channel that's the CCS playing a role. And actually, the switch from the fossil to non-fossil technologies under this design is very limited because it does not provide additional incentive for renewables to increase in the power system. But if we introduce the auctioning in the ETS, we will see the total emission on the left will further reduce. And on the right, we will observe like the renewable also will play a role. And when we decompose the emissions by different channels, we will see the green part under the auctioning, the switch from the fossil to non-fossil technologies will play a much more substantial role in future China's power system decarbonization. This actually suggests that with the same market-based policy tool, we can actually fine-tune their different design to push them in different direction and incentivize the whole decarbonization of the power or energy system. So that's all I have for today. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Professor Zhang, for coming in the last minute and providing that really great overview of the research going on at Tsinghua and your institute, and really giving a really recent policy changes and estimates in China that I'm sure was really exciting for our audience to take a look at. So thanks so much for providing that. So yeah, the last panelist today to give an overview of their work will be Ankur Malyan. Ankur is a policy researcher working at the Council of Energy, Environment and Water, New Delhi, India, in the Low Carbon Pathways team. He has been working in the energy and climate change domain, exploring the near and long-term aspects of energy transitions and mitigation pathways. We are so honored to have you here today, and please share your screen and take it away before our panel discussion begins.
Thanks, Michelle. Let me just go to my slides. I hope the slides are visible and I'm audible.
Yep, everything is perfect.
Wonderful. It's my pleasure, and thanks Cell Press for organizing these. And I'm the last panelist here, so I got a wonderful chance to listen to all the esteemed people existing here on the panel. And listen a lot about, say, China's pathways and what has been happening in Africa, and what are the other things going around in the equity front. But I'm here, we'll be talking about India's pathway to net zero economy. India is quite important from a global perspective as well, because we are expected to be the next energy leader and next energy biggest consumer. So I'll start with introducing the institution, because many of us will not be aware that CW is among Asia's leading policy research institution, and we work across many focus areas ranging from energy access to renewables and power sector. I am part of a part of the low carbon pathways team, where we look at the near term and long term scenario analysis. CW research has been instrumental in informing India's net zero debate, whether it ranges from the technology front, we explored the CCUS, or we explored the pathways for net zero, which was also contributed to the announcement that happened in the Glasgow, and from the stakeholders perspective as well, because we see that this is going to be an economic, technological, and stakeholder transformation we are looking at when we go to net zero economy. So I quickly deep dive into what happened at COP26. So we all know that there has been a re-emphasis that we have to keep the world within 1.5 degrees C. So India announced its Panchamrit. Panchamrit simply translates into the 5 exilers to combat climate change, what India is going to do, which range from enhancing the NDCs from 33% to 45% now, expanding non-fossil electricity capacity to 500 gigawatts, 50% electricity capacity from renewables by 2030. But last but not the least, we had the announcement which everybody was waiting for, the net zero net zero target, and India announced to reach net zero by 2070. There was a strong emphasis on common but differentiated responsibility or equity. We have been talking about equity among different groups, but there's a geographic equity also in terms of carbon space, which we should talk about. And there was a fair demand which India put forward for the climate finance to go through a difficult transition, which we are looking at. To go to a net zero scenario, power sector it will be instrumental, and we know that it is going to be a long hanging fruit considering the changes we have been seeing in the solar and wind. So electricity sector is going to expand in a big way. Right now, we range somewhere around 1300 terawatt hours. We are expected to go up to 21,000 terawatt hours in future, and this expansion of power sector is linked to the electricity demand that is going to increase significantly across the end use sectors when we go for a net zero target. I'll also quickly talk about how to really read this graph. So the black line here represents the reference scenario. The shaded line, the shaded region represents the technology availability, because we see that hydrogen and CCS are going to be the 2 breakthrough technologies that can transform the energy system in a big way. So we have different combinations where we can have hydrogen and CCS availability or not available in future. The dotted lines showcase the 2017 net zero pathways. In addition to this technology combination, and also the shaded region explores the different net zero targets. So basically this study was published before the Glasgow announcement. So we explored 2015 net zero, 2016 net zero, 2017 and 2018 net zero. And based on the recommendation, 2070 comes out to be the most feasible and rightful decision for the country. Now, when we talk about the power system, coal is another major issue. India is currently dependent significantly on coal for meeting its need. We see that if India commits to 2070 net zero, the coal has to peak by 2040 and reduce by nearly 99%, which simply means it will be nearly phased out within next 20 years from 2040 to 2060. CCS, however, could give a lifeline in a short term, because we see that there are communities which have lives and livelihood dependent on coal. If CCS becomes feasible, the share of fossil fuel in the primary energy mix could range from somewhere around 19%, which could give a short-term lifeline to the coal investors and the communities dependent on this technology. Solar is going to be the primary option in which the switch happens. However, we also see that the solar's capacity is going to expand significantly. Right now, we are somewhere around 40 gigawatts in the country, which is expected to be somewhere around 70 to 100 gigawatts by 2100. By 2070, when the net zero happens with hydrogen availability without CCS, we are expected to reach somewhere around 5600 gigawatts. That's going to be massive. Also, we have a near-term target of 500 gigawatts, which simply translate that within the 2-hour conversation we are having right now, there should be some 20 megawatts installment already happened within that time frame. And if it doesn't happen, that we are actually backlogging the capacities which are yet to be deployed on ground. Electrification is a way forward for the end use sectors. We see across all the end use sector, whether it's a building sector, industrial sector, or the transport sector, the share of electrification is going to be huge. Building sector already depends on electricity in a lot of services, except for the cooking, where we see the LPG is going in a big way, replacing biomass currently, and in future, gas expansion will also be instrumental. However, it's not the case that electricity is a bit difficult, but it's also a behavioral issue that we see in the building sector, where people are a bit resistant to adopt electricity as a cooking fuel. Industry sector is not only hindered by the technology, but it's also hindered by the financial aspects. If a investor has already invested in a fossil-based technology which have a lifetime of 40 years, then we can expect that until 2060, from today, anything happens before that, there will be a loss to his investment. In that case, the investors are also skeptical in investing into the new technologies. However, we see when we go to the net zero scenario, the share of electrification in the industrial sector will have to go from 18% currently to 80% in future. In the transport sector also, we see that there has to be a significant increase in the electrification, say up to 80% by 2070. So coal use in the industrial sector is another important sector where coal is being used in a big way. And in the industrial sector also, coal must peak by 2040 and reduce by nearly 97% within the next 25 years. If hydrogen becomes feasible, it gives a slightly lifeline towards the electrification extent we need. And there is a possibility of having hydrogen uptake in the industrial sector as well as the transport sector. In the industrial sector, by 2017 at zero, we can have up to 20% of the hydrogen supporting the needs of the industrial sector. And in the hydrogen in the transport sector can support up to 35% by 2070. With this expanding infrastructure and investments across the technologies, we also see that there will be a nexus in which a constraint will happen, that is land. India is a growing country, and land is actually in a constraint for different end users, whether it's a food security or a rapidly expanding population. We see that India's power sector will be acquiring like 4.6% of the total land, which is a big number comparing the constraints and the competition that happens in the land as a resource. Jobs and transition is another aspect that is quite important. Currently, there are more than 1.8 million people depending on coal directly, indirectly in India. India is a combination of like 28 states. There are many states in the eastern belt of India that completely depends on coal, say Odisha. If we talk about Odisha, Odisha's economy is completely dependent on coal and the lives and livelihood of the people also. If we are saying that Odisha have to go out of coal, technically at this point of time, they don't have a plan in place. So we can't say that, that the state will be left behind. That's the point that we always highlight, that net zero transition for India is not about it's not only about the climate policy, it is also about the economic transformation in a big way. The economies have to find different ways to expand and different ways to transform themselves. However, we see if we go to a net zero scenario, in the full-time equivalent perspective, there will be an increase in the green jobs. That is a good indication. However, we also need significant contribution towards skill development, because the people are not really skilled with the right skill sets. But technological success such as hydrogen and CCS will make this transition relatively easier. We see that if the CCS is not available, the carbon price could go up to $900 per ton of CO2. However, it could be half if CCS becomes feasible, which simply means how relevant it could be to make this technology successful. At the same time, the policy cost, which is in terms of percentage of GDP, if we do not have CCS in place, the policy cost in 2070 would be around more than 4%. However, it could be around 2.8% or so if CCS is feasible. So we know that availability of these technologies or the right investment in research and development could make the transition relatively easier. Now I'm coming towards the end of my presentation, and I would like to highlight the 5 elements of India's net zero future, which we always say. Like the Prime Minister Modi used the term Panchamrit, which simply translates to 5 exilers. So I formed the narrative Panch Tattva, which also means 5 elements of net zero future. So the first element is investment. We need new emerging investment opportunities in renewables and hydrogen and CCS. Currently, we have been seeing investment as a hindrance, that there have been existing investments in the fossil fuel technology, and that's much more easier. But the investor should look at this as an opportunity, because there are other emerging opportunities that are coming up in future. Infrastructure is another important. We have to build a net zero ready nation. Right now, we have been focusing on expanding the infrastructure, but there is a need for investment and infrastructure expansion, whether it's for EV or hydrogen-ready pipelines in future. Research and development is the third component or the third element that is important for the India's net zero future. Right now, or I would say until now, India have been a technology borrower, but there is a clear indication that India wants to be a technology co-generator or co-innovator now. So there's a paradigm shift which we are looking at and which we expect while going forward. If we really look to be on the technology borrower front, or we might miss the bus. So that's pretty important. We have to focus that the net zero transition is the people's transition. It is not without the people, and nobody can left behind. Just transition is equally important, and we need a well-planned and well-managed just transition. And there should be like a policy and focus towards social and environmental justice. And the last thing is the political economy. India is much more complex than we see from outside. We have policies such as cross subsidy. In the last slides, I've already showcased that the electrification in the industrial sector must go from 18% to 80%. But right now, industrial sector is taxed heavily in terms of electricity just to provide the affordable electricity to the residential consumers. This kind of cross subsidy cannot be sustainable if we want the industrial sector to take up electricity as a primary fuel. So this kind of political economy constraint has to go away. So I'll just stop here. Thank you, and happy to listen more from everyone else.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Ankur. And you alluded quite perfectly to hydrogen, which will be the topic, the panel after the next one of today. So I'm really pointing to this whole dialogue that we're having throughout the conference, throughout the presentation. But right now, what I really want to do, first, thank you so much for providing overviews of your field and all the work that you're doing, which was amazing. But it would be really great to jump into panel discussion. We have about a half hour here with each other. And so the audience can also ask some questions in the chat platform, and we'll try to collect the key questions. And if we can't answer them all here, at least try to get something around where it could be published with the website maybe in the future. So the first question is, as was discussed in the opening plenary by Sam Fankhauser, if we address climate change correctly, there will be economic rewards. And as Denise so perfectly kind of explained at that overview slide of her presentation of these co-benefits of decarbonization. So there are other benefits to energy system decarbonization. So when considering broad electrification goals, how can we more effectively and efficiently achieve multiple goals during the transition? For example, if we're thinking about goals about public health, urbanization, growth of infrastructure, air quality, as well as economic development all at the same time, doing that efficiently and accelerating that process sounds kind of hard. So I just wanted to hear what your thoughts were first. I don't know if you want to take it away first, Denise, as I called your presentation out.
Well, thanks for the question. The co-benefits of increased electrification are really clear, and that's an area that's really great to see the world moving in quickly. Electrification, obviously, with coal or other fossil fuels has big negative consequences for air quality and also for water use, but electrification with renewables has clear benefits because they don't require water, they don't emit air pollutants. We do have the challenges of the necessary minerals, et cetera. We do have the challenges of storage, what we do to provide reliable electricity. And since hydrogen's been mentioned and will be discussed later today, I just thought I would put a point in here that is a disbenefit potentially, because there's not just co-benefits, the synergies, there's also the trade-offs. And a potential problem with hydrogen is that if it leaks, it's an indirect greenhouse gas. So hydrogen reacts with OH, the free radical in the atmosphere, which is the primary mechanism by which reactive greenhouse gases are removed from the atmosphere. And so if hydrogen reduces OH concentrations, that extends the lifetime of compounds like methane, which increases the warming from methane and other greenhouse gases that are reactive. So I think if the world is really going to start thinking about a hydrogen economy, they really need to think carefully about how to minimize leakage to avoid this disbenefit. And thinking about it more now myself, I've come to think that maybe electrification will work well enough for the transport sector that we won't need to have millions of vehicles all running on fuel cells. And rather, if that hydrogen was used in the power sector to smooth intermittency and in the industrial sector in ways where it's relatively constrained, we could avoid these huge distribution networks that could potentially leak a lot and have this indirect negative consequence for climate.
Thanks for kicking off that question and the answer. I think that makes a lot of sense and is interesting to think about. Does anybody want to add to that, to this kind of acceleration of meeting multiple goals at the same time?
I mean, I think one thing to highlight, and Denise really hit it off with kind of these trade-offs for hydrogen, is that we are assuming that the future economy will be tighter and cleaner and better managed and regulated than the current one. The hydrogen story is one that, I would go back to the person who I often think is the most impressive on this sort of thinking, and that's the former Minister of Science and Technology in China, Zhang, who really highlighted early on what it would take to both electrify the light-duty fleet in China and where he saw and where his ministry saw the opportunities for heavy-duty hydrogen. And it's exactly along the lines that Denise highlighted. For me, I would just come back to the simple metric, though, and that is that when I got into this field, we really did think about that most of our near-term challenges were technical. And now most of our near-term challenges are market and policy and justice and equity. Doesn't mean doesn't mean we don't need to keep innovating on all these fronts, but we really are assuming that our social and our economic mechanisms catch up with our technical ability. And if we do that, I really don't see big challenges here, but that's the area where we have been cheating and dragging our feet, to put it mildly, and subsidizing the wrong thing. And there's no real reason to think that good technology solves the other human problem, and that is greed. And figuring out how we do this in a way that actually accelerates these pro-people, pro-job agenda, that's one where I would say we're way behind. And so all of us who are technical, I think, really have to learn more on the social side of the equation, because we're lagging dramatically there.
So actually that brings to the next point where I really wanted to bring up, and I want to ask the question out loud, even though you kind of answered what your perspective would be, Dan. But that deeper electrification that we're talking about today is predicted to create very different patterns and the demand for electricity that we've not been familiar with during the energy transition. So my question is more, how do you think this should be addressed by researchers? So you kind of suggest that maybe to be more aware of their social science side when they're thinking about their technology. I kind of want to hear also from the rest of the panel what you think, especially there might be a lot of young researchers on the call right now.
So Michelle, may I come in for that question? Definitely, I do resonate with what Dan said for the last question, that we have to be cognizant of the social side or the other side of the angle. But right now, when we talk about, say, electrification, there have been challenges on the technology front in a big way, especially in the industrial sector. There have been sectors where electricity is not really a solution. And if electricity is not really a solution, for instance, the iron making process, where currently coal is being used in a big way, the alternatives we see is the natural gas and hydrogen only. What we really do, right? That's a big constraint, and iron steel is not really a smaller sector, and so does the cement. So cement also doesn't have electricity as a solution. So both of these two sectors are actually constrained by the technology. If the technology is available, then we might see that investors or the players that actually are in the business might go towards electrification, but right now they can't. That's a reality. So there needs to be a significant advancement in research and technology, that how we actually break that barrier and come up with the solutions that can help. Iron steel sector could be, if scrap is one way, but at one time we might be losing out on the scrap as well. What we're going to do in future. Then at the same time, for the cement sector, we can look at carbon capture utilization part of it. We have different ways of utilizing the carbon and come up with some different concrete blocks to altogether replace cement and use something else. But there have to be technological advancements to solve that issue. And definitely, once the technology is available, then comes the social part of it, that how you make that to be adopted by the people of the country. So that's it from my end.
One thing that I'll add on to Ankur's discussion is that within the different sectors, I think that having the data and tracking the data and understanding that can really help. So, for example, with deployment of smart meters in the residential sector, we've been able to see this energy limiting behavior that I talked about earlier. And I think that, with smart meters, the work that Dan had presented earlier with the EVs and, looking at how, they're charging, right, with the app, the more data that you have about where people are parking around the city, that can also help you identify different opportunities for some of that demand balancing, as well as in the residential sector, when you're looking at the differences between different income groups, different minority groups, especially within a smaller geographic region, you can tie that to different price signals and actually see, well, how large is the price signal going to be in order to change that energy consumption. One thing that we have seen is that for the price signals in the residential sector, at least in the US, it takes about a year for people to actually change their behavior. And that's because you whenever you get your energy bill, you have these two bars next to each other that say, this is how much you used last year, and this is how much you've used this year. And then people actually start to adapt and they see those bills, but because they come typically on a monthly time period, it does take a while to adjust. So then if we think about apps, right, and how apps actually change behavior, as we saw with the EV charging, maybe an app on people's phones in the residential sector says hey, you're using a lot of energy, but you're about to go into fossil fuel territory when we're going to start ramping up with really expensive natural gas. And so then you might actually see quicker changes in that behavior. And so kind of thinking about different, triggers and different points of entry for behavior incentivization could also be really helpful in managing that supply and demand match.
Ankur, you raised your hand. Do you have something to add?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to share one incident because Destiny just talked about the smart meter one. So our institution have installed smart meter in tier 2 city in India, and we usually undermine the power of awareness. We find it to be cliche, but that's extremely important that the consumer has to be significantly aware that what is going to happen when we actually install these kind of things. So what we face that when we install the smart meters into the tier 2 city and people start becoming accountable that how much they are using, they end up demanding that this smart meters have to be removed because it was from a not-for-profit institution, and as per them, the smart meters were the reasons that why they were getting the higher bills. So many times the accountability of themselves becomes an issue. They have to be aware enough that how much they are using. There are other factors, for instance, if it is a summer season and we have a significant cooling demand and they have been using ACs and they have not been getting their ACs serviced, then they are becoming more inefficient and consuming more energy. So there are n number of factors that impact that electricity bill. But for them, the only intervention that happened is that they moved from a conventional meter to a smart meter. So that kind of awareness is significantly important. And right now, even in the tier 1 cities, which are like quite high in income levels, they don't have smart meters in India right now. And tier 2 are far and tier 3 are much farther away. So that's the situation here.
So I guess I will add to that in the smart meters that we had, that we connected with the utility in Arizona, they weren't always seeing it. So they didn't have those apps that I had mentioned that might be a potential innovation. And I do think that, if the smart meter like kind of prevents skating by in the system, right, then it may also increase backlash, right? But I think that for the awareness side of things, when I was thinking about like being aware of energy limiting behavior, it was more on the utility side. That's what kind of more where my research was focusing on, if we actually can identify energy limiting behavior, when those costs do fall and people do start using their systems more, we really do need to understand like how that demand may increase. And if you can actually tie like a price signal to that change and understand how that has impacted how that has gotten people closer to the amount of energy that they actually wanted to use in the first place, right? Then we can kind of be better at predicting demand.
And I have to say, I think an anecdote doesn't prove or disprove this, but I gave a talk recently at Chongqing University and talked about the data availability. And literally during the 50 minutes of my talk, a student designed an app that read out the data and provided an economic signal for people to do net metering sales back. And so that student, a student at Chongqing University and a student at Berkeley, founded a little company. And they actually provide real-time data. And, my generation is really bad at likes and apps and social media, but, it is my daughter's generation are really good at it. And so I'm actually not convinced that we are particularly limited here. I think we're very inexperienced in using these signals back, but certainly places that really want to make this transition will have local differences. But ultimately, whether you're a home or a business or a big industry, you're going to have to be able to take advantage of the clean energy market, which means net metering, smart metering is going to have to become universal. And we've been stumbling into it in the ways that Ankur and Destenie highlighted. But this is one of our smallest possible hurdles. I mean, this is one we have to be able to get right. And we all know we're very good at it on social media. And so if we can do it there, we can do it here.
Yeah, I think this, we have Destenie, one of the leading experts on a just transition, that I want to shift into that part of the conversation today, but it is related because just recently, because we're talking about utility bills here, I received a letter in my own personal mail where I could switch to a renewable energy grid source for my electricity, but for the immediate future, my bill would go up about 5%. Now, while I may be aware of the importance of this, I may be in a financial place where I can take on this burden at this time. There are people who obviously can't. And this is something that has to be thought about in this discussion. So I wanted to ask here, how would you approach discussions like this? Maybe just to explain this type of choice to somebody who doesn't understand the difference between the grids. That would be number one. But then also, how should this be addressed in the future? This is a more serious question about how it would be a place in a difficulty on low-income households.
So I guess one of the things that really comes to mind first with understanding this need for a just transition is building off of the work that Dan and Denise had presented. So Dan had talked about the fact that low-income and minority populations adopt less solar panels, and then Denise had talked about like heat pump adoption as well as electrification of the heating sector. And when we're thinking about low-income populations, a large proportion of them are renters who are actually not able to adopt these technologies on their own. They do not have the capability of changing the infrastructure within their household. And so one of the biggest challenges of that is to, for the energy adoption, just like kind of reducing the need for like the distribution network, is getting the landlords to upgrade their infrastructure, which it can be a very big hurdle, but does need to happen. And then additionally, for that, because landlords, don't have this incentive to upgrade their infrastructure, then low-income residents typically live in very inefficient housing, right? So that no insulation, right? The systems are very old. And so that 5% increase could actually seem a lot bigger to these low-income households that are living in these very energy inefficient places. And so I think that when we are talking about a just transition and the residential sector, we do need to think about how we can also improve our housing stock, right? So a part of the energy crisis is strongly related to the housing crisis. And, one way to overcome that is to allow low-income households to buy renewable energy, but that also might mean that, they need more subsidies to be able to not see those price increases while also supporting the just transition.
Thank you. I think Denise has her hand up.
So just following up from what Destenie was discussing for the US, for China, I think one thing that will be important is to have subsidies for poor households to use heat pumps, capital subsidies, so that heat pumps can be adopted. And I think right now there's a tendency to have fuel subsidies so that there's less expensive gas or electricity for poor communities and residential use in China. And that actually can encourage waste. But if you can have subsidies for things that are high capital expenditures, but which are very, very efficient, that will be a better long-term solution. And in fact, I think it'll be a better short-term solution too, because the poor households will be able to acquire this device that works well and that maintains their operating costs at a low level going forward. We're seeing this happening right now in Beijing, but I mean, the question is, how is that going to go forward in some of these other northern provinces which have high heating demands?
And again, it's true. It's true almost everywhere in the world that if you think you're doing an energy project or a transportation project or an infrastructure project, for a great deal of the money is involved in the local real estate project. And we often think about these things as bridges and buildings and this and that, but the real bucks are being made by those behind the scenes, whether they're individuals or central party officials or whoever it might be. And so not recognizing those, not only the pressure points, but also the challenges there, I think is a big hurdle. And so a lot of the efforts to push back against really making our energy choices equitable for low-income people is really along the lines that Destenie highlighted, that you have to deal with the so-called split incentive. And so policies that do not find a way to reward property owners or property speculators, or whatever it is, to put money into low-income communities so that renters, people who are leasing vehicles access it, are almost always doomed to failure. And so in California, we have something called a solar gardens law. And that doesn't just, it has a carrot and a stick. It has a plus and a minus. It penalizes property owners who do not install clean energy and it rewards them when they do so, but the benefits are split with their tenants. And so that's a policy that there's lots and lots of tools to resist, because the rich have made the rules in most countries, and so they find ways to insulate themselves. But it's that area where public policy is most critical. You have to split the incentives, you have to share the benefits with low-income people, and in many cases to do more so. And so when California said we would be devoting 35% of our cap and trade monies to low-income and people who are most directly exposed, that was seen at the time as unworkable, massively impossible. It would ruin incentives. In fact, it has not. New York State has matched us. And now again, the Biden administration, which has not got the political muscle yet to push the policies through, has at least adopted as their guiding point. I think that's the kind of thing that certainly my office at the U.S. Agency for International Development is working most closely with the international partners on, so that the next wave of innovations clearly reward low-income people around the world. And that's going to be, I think, a much harder fight. And it's one that myself as a physicist feel particularly ill-equipped to address.
Ankur, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I would like to add what just Destenie and Denise said. So what Destenie highlighted, it's quite similar in India as well, that people, even they, hold a apartment or something, they do not have the roof rights. So distributed energy, distributed solar is quite difficult. Rooftop has been, the focus from like more than 5 to 7 years now, but we see a very limited uptake just because of this issue, that they do not have the roof rights. And even though the people have the roof rights, they are not willing to compromise their access to roof, which will be then occupied by the rooftop solar. So the opportunity cost which people look at is quite important, that what they want to use the roof for, and are they really understanding the benefits what they might be getting with the net metering. And the second point which I wanted to highlight here is that it's important to understand that how people of a specific geography are making choices. Many choices are being made on the, say, total cost of ownership or the lifetime expenditure ones. And but especially in the low income households, the choices are usually made at the upfront money they have to pay, or the capital cost of a certain technology. So for instance, we do have electric vehicles coming in India, but in Indian rupees terms, any conventional car you will get from 5 to 7 lakhs INR, whereas the least, like the efficient and equivalent electric vehicle is for 14 lakhs after the subsidy which we get, which is like nearly twice. So do I want to invest in that? I might, because I do understand the the operational benefits of it, or the lifetime cost savings which I'll get probably. But a low income household person, which is actually dealing with much more immediate needs, might think that why would I buy a twice expensive car in the near term, because he's quite uncertain about the long term expenditure. And so that's a trade-off that happens, and when people make a choice, and it's important to understand that within a geography, how different income groups are actually making those choices.
Thank you for adding that on. I don't know who had their hand up first. Sorry. Da?
Sure. I would like just to add that besides the importance of having residential sector switching from the fossil energy to renewable, in countries like China and other developing countries that have a very large share of the industry sector, is also very important to have some mechanism established for industry users to shift from using electricity generated from coal to renewable. And I think, well, at least according to my experience in China, the government is now very open to new ideas, new designs. And as far as I know, starting from last year, when I worked with the central government, the National Reform and Development Reform Commission, National Energy Agency, and MEE, a lot of new policies just came out because the industry has some, the new demand. Like for example, the renewable electricity PPA was not existed in China before, just because some companies, the multinational companies like BASF, some fast-moving consumer companies, some state company in China, they just presented a demand to the government that we want to purchase renewable electricity directly, but there's no such a mechanism. And then the government feel the pressure, and then they actually, with us, they design these specific policies to allow those industry users to spend additional money to buy renewables. So then I think the customers of those industrial sectors, I think we should also can play a role, or as researchers to play a role to have arranged their more incentive for them or a mechanism for them to buy renewable electricity.
I guess one thing I'll build on.
Oh, I was just going to call on you. That was okay.
Okay. I was just going to say one thing that I will add from Da's point about the coordination challenges is that when we are kind of moving forward with this just transition, having coordination between different entities is vital. So, for example, as we switch away from the natural gas sector, every person who has trouble switching off is going to make it harder to reach that last mile of electrification. And when we are thinking about electrification, we will need to do a lot of infrastructure upgrades. So, as a side note, I recently became a landlord, and when I wanted to switch over my renter's house to an electric stove instead of a gas stove, I had to call the electrician, call the gas company. You got to get the gas switched off. Then you got to get the electrician to upgrade the wires just for the stove. And then I was thinking, well, why not have a package where you can upgrade your wiring all at once, right? So if somebody wants to electrify, then you really should be upgrading all of the electrical wires within the house at once, right? So you should have it for the transportation, for the potential EV that could be parked outside, for the stove and the heater and things like that. But if we do them one at a time and you all have to go in and rip out the walls every single time, it's going to be very, very expensive. And then, it's not going to be as feasible, especially for the low income households. And so that is really important to get that coordination piece between all the different, entities within the energy sector, which kind of brings us back to, I believe Dan made the point earlier about this just transition and this kind of decarbonization effort assumes that we are operating in a place that is well coordinated and where entities are actually working together very well. And that is all about not only the behavior of the consumers, but the behavior of all the stakeholders, right?
Yeah, go ahead, Denise. I think your hand's up now.
So I was actually going to follow on from what Da was saying about the industrial sector being important, and I completely agree. We've actually been working a bit on the industrial sector, looking at symbiotic infrastructure systems in China. And there's opportunities there. This is some work being done by a postdoc, Yang Guo, in my group, who's at Tsinghua previously, but it's actually still in Beijing because of COVID. But we've been looking at, for example, bridging wastewater treatment in the coal power sector. So we can take water from the wastewater treatment to use in the coal power sector and sludge to be burned, or using in China's industrial parks opportunities for municipal solid waste to energy, and then potentially using some of the area that they have to generate electricity. One thing we're seeing here is increasing conversations about putting solar panels on the rooftops of big box stores and also above parking lots. We have huge parking lots here, which probably don't exist in China, but we're even seeing them like at the university where they're putting them on the rooftops of parking garages that are multi-level. And so trying to use rooftops for increased solar generation, in industrial parks or in parking lots that are then land that wouldn't otherwise be used. You're not compromising land. It's not like I think Ankur said, well, there's not that much space in India for solar, and there's not that much space perhaps in China in the eastern part of the country for solar. But if you do it on existing rooftops, if you do it on existing parking areas, you can expand a lot without having to use green land that would be better left either alone or for agriculture. So I think thinking increasingly about synergies in these solutions between the industry and different areas, between the residential sector and the power sector, sort of a more holistic thought process that integrates all of these different aspects together will be valuable.
I know it just feels like our conversation got started, but we're actually nearing the end of our conversation. I just wanted to give each panelist maybe a quick moment or two if they wanted to highlight to the audience, which again, maybe a lot of young scientists or older scientists, a whole group of people. What do you think the priority? We talked a lot about the just transition here. We talked about co-benefits. We talked about the grid in a small part, but what priority in the next year, 10 years and 50 years, and it could be a short answer, or it could be whatever you think would be in those different time frames that when we're talking about electrification, we should really be trying to think about. I don't know who wants to take it on first.
Well, I guess I'll just say, I mean, it's a huge field and everything has to be done very, very fast. So there's incredible opportunities to do well by doing good, I always say. And I guess the one thing I encourage people to do is to not just think very narrowly, but to look broadly and think about the implications of changes on a sphere larger than just the single thing they're looking at. Because, you know, if we only look at the supply side and say, let's go for renewables and hydrogen, we have some downsides to that. But if we look, okay, well, we should reduce demand, well, then there's some benefits there. And then we can, we can have a smaller increase in supply, which means we don't have to mine as much, et cetera. The other thing I think is that how quickly we're able to reduce is incredibly important. When China came out with its target of a peaking by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060, everyone was super excited. That was a huge step forward. But now when you think about it, what the curve looks like is extremely important. If you peak at 2030 and stay high for a long time and come down steeply at the end, the total emissions are much, much larger than if you come down quickly and then have a long tail to address the really difficult challenges like industry. And so everything has to happen as soon as possible. The urgency could not be greater. And I think we always have to keep that in mind.
Just go next probably. So when what I would like to say is that when we look at these transitions happening, it's, as I have already mentioned, this is about people's transition as well. This is about economic transformations. One thing that is extremely important is also the institutional transformation which we need. For instance, in India, we have Coal India Limited. Why don't we look at as Solar India Limited in 30 years down the line? And that's completely possible because the economies which we are seeing in future will be completely different. India of 2070 is not going to be India of 2020. People will be with much more higher income. People will be having much more advanced technologies and access. So many challenges which we see right now might not be the challenges in the future. So we have to be cognizant of that while making the choices. Right now, we might see that in short term, as you said, like in next year or 10 years, we might see them as challenges, but maybe not 20 years down the line. So when we invest in certain technologies, we should keep in mind that we are doing it for the people who are currently at $2,000 per capita, but they will not be the people of $2,000 per capita in 2050. They will be reaching around $15,000 or $20,000 per capita in future. So that's what I want to highlight. Thanks.
I guess one thing that I will chime in.
Oh, sorry. Destenie, go on.
No, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say I agree with really Denise, and that is the challenges we have to move quickly, and the surest way to move quickly, unfortunately, is to move capital. And so getting investment in these areas is critical. We don't want to make all the mistakes of the past, but we've waited so many decades past the point when we should have been acting, that getting capital involved in this process is one that we're going to have to really speed up. And that's the one where, unfortunately, the international process is very poorly equipped.
And so then building on that, I will say that while we do need to move quickly, we also need to make sure that we're investing time into those communities that are very skeptical of the system. So kind of building on how Ankur mentioned that with the smart meters, people wanted to stop using them because they didn't trust them, because they thought their bills were getting much higher. And so that like if you do move so quickly but you don't add in the community engagement piece, like the education, the understanding, then that also could hinder and derail the energy transition as well. And so I think that we have to move really quickly in terms of like getting the investments, like getting the money committed, but then also like working on building those community relationships and understanding things like, you know, how are low-income groups and vulnerable groups actually using their energy? How much energy would they actually like to use, right? Getting that demand prediction right is going to be very important, while also deploying a lot more of the smart meter technologies in these areas to understand energy usage and electrifying other sectors as well.
And I also very much agree with all the speakers' insights. And I would say that for young scientists, it's a very exciting area to live in. And I think for the next 30 or 40 years, for the career of most young scientists, so it's like the critical period for decarbonizing. So I think maybe like for us, we need to be very forward-looking, and we may, as researchers, need to think some issues that is not visible but may happen in the future. Like if we have like many terawatts of the wind and solar, how about the recycling would be? And if we want to plant a lot of trees, and will it like compete with the agriculture? And if we have a lot of the CCS deployment, is there any like security or other issues? I think for those things that we don't see too much in the near future, but we expect that will play a very important role in the distant future, not too much distant. I think we as a young scientist should do something. Thanks.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this first panel on the conference Net Zero and Beyond, Pathways to Decarbonization. On behalf of Cell Press and BMSTC, I first want to thank so much to our speakers, most of whom are at terrible time zones right now to be giving these talks. So thank you so much for being here and for the wonderful discussion. And thanks so much to our audience for being here. And I hope you tune in for the rest of the conference. And have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.